This week we're going to be looking at the long 19th century. What I mean by a long century is that we'll be looking at some of the bit of the century before, and the things that we're looking at will just tip over into the following century. But as ever, you can't even look at the 19th century, even if you're looking at it as a long 19th century, on its own. And so we're going to start with two of the key things that happened in the preceding centuries. The first is the agricultural revolution. In the century up to 1750, changes occurred in agriculture, and these were to make a massive difference on how productive the land was. One of these was the introduction of the four-course crop rotation, often called Norfolk, because that's where, in this country, it was first brought in, although it had been developed overseas in Flanders. What happened is, instead of having a fallow year, you had fodder crops, turnips and clover, for 2 of the years, and you had grain crops for 2 other years. So that meant that you could use those crops to replenish the soil, and what you got out of them you could feed your animals, which also produced manure to replenish your soil. There were improvements in the plough, which meant you needed fewer oxen or horses to draw it. Enclosure was a big change in making land more economic, although perhaps it was a massive change to the structure of society. Up to this point, around villages there were fields, and each of the people in the village would have the right to till certain bits of those fields, a different bit in each field. So you had a different bit of soil type to make sure you had enough to live on. There were also areas which were common land where you could keep your animals. Enclosure changed that. The land was now formally owned by an overall farmer, who would then use the peasants to work their land. Common land was broken up into fields. The ability to move produce more readily also made a difference, developing canals and eventually railways. Land conversion, land drains, reclaiming land. In North Lincolnshire, there's an area called the Isle of Axholme. It was an isle because originally there were just 3 or 4 bits of land which were high enough for people to live on. The rest of it was very boggy. But with skills that were brought over by the Dutch, who had been reclaiming land on their side of the North Sea, it was drained. Whole new areas of land were opened up. And one particular product that became very popular in this area was beetroot. A vast amount of the country's beetroot is grown on the Isle of Axholme. Another impact of this was selective breeding. People had worked out that you could breed animals to be better use for meat. In this period, cows started to be kept not just for milk, but for the meat that you could get from them directly. You no longer killed all the boy calves. You kept them and grew them up and ate the meat. The outcome was that agricultural output grew faster than the population in the century up to 1770. And even after that, land productivity remained one of the highest in the world. This increase in the food supply meant that fewer people died of famine. People still had large families, but the children didn't die. And so we had a rapid increase in population from 5 million to 9 million through to 25 million over a comparatively short period of time. It's worth thinking about what difference this made to the life of country vicars. when the population was 5 million and you had perhaps the same number of vicars we have today, how many did you have to look after in your parishes? Once the population is 25 million, it's a very different role. The other aspect of having the agricultural revolution was that these people who were surviving could work elsewhere. Because while the technological developments had happened on the farms, in the 18th century, a series of other technological developments led to rapid changes in society. New machines powered by coal enabled large-scale production. And so textiles moved from being cottage industry, something you did alongside looking after your animals, to being somewhere which was done in great mills. For over half a century, Great Britain took over from Asia as the manufacturing centre of the world. By the end of the 19th century, America had supplanted the UK. People moved to where the jobs were. They were no longer needed on the land. They moved into the towns. And so you get, in this period, rapid urbanisation. Every industry had technological breakthroughs, but the most significant were innovations to the steam engine. This gave a supply of power that did not depend on the wind or water supply. It also enabled the growth of railways, which took away the limitations of geography. Raw materials and goods could be transported to where they were needed. New factories employed the unskilled population, which was growing. So basically they moved from rural slums to urban slums and continued to work long hours for low wages. Instead of the rhythm of nature, they had the constant monotony of factory jobs. There was an emphasis on precision and the avoidance of waste. And the sin of drunkenness challenged these new values of the capitalist system. Church of England was slow to respond to the demographic shifts caused by industrial innovations. People had moved from their rural parishes, crowding into the newly expanded towns. Each new parish created needed a new Act of Parliament. This was time-consuming and costly. So in many ways the people became beyond the care of the parish system of the Church of England. No churches, no clergy. But Methodism didn't have the same problems. It was able to go where the established church could not. And other dissenters also set up chapels in the cities. Although, to be honest, church attendance wasn't high. In the 1851 census, about 30% of those who could have attended church on a Sunday didn't. Church absenteeism was highest in the industrial towns of the north. One of the problems there was that of class. Many churches became middle-class preserves as the middle class developed. So the working class wanted to go to church, had to go elsewhere. The Wesleyans and the Congregationalists attracted the middle class. The Baptists, tabernacles, and primitive Methodists, Bethels, often attracted the working classes. Well, the parish church was the Tory party at prayer. Often parish churches did set up preaching halls or mission churches in poorer parts of the cities, but they were in many ways a second thought. And those who went to the chapels took on new values. Drink was out, family, self-improvement and Sunday school education were in. But more of that later. The next major thing we're going to look at now is the Enlightenment, a major philosophical development of the 18th and 19th centuries. In part, the Enlightenment was possible exactly because of those developments in agriculture. Let me explain. Those who owned land had now more productive land. More productive land meant you could get more money. Landowners became richer, and that meant they had time either themselves to devote to thinking about life, or they could give money to others. The church no longer had the control it had on education. Alternative schools and universities were being formed. It was possible to start thinking in ways that hadn't been possible before, for example, the Reformation. And in the middle of this comes the movement called the Enlightenment. Listen to this. This is exactly the sort of thought experiment that you would have got in the Enlightenment. The pig that wants to be eaten. After 40 years of vegetarianism, Max Berger was about to sit down to a feast of pork sausages, crispy bacon, and pan-fried chicken breast. Max had always missed the taste of meat, but his principles were stronger than his culinary cravings. But now he was able to eat meat with a clear conscience. The sausages and bacon had come from a pig called Priscilla. He had met the week before. The pig had been genetically engineered to be able to speak, and more importantly, to want to be eaten. Ending up on a human's table was Priscilla's lifetime ambition, and she woke up on the day of her slaughter with a keen sense of anticipation. She had told all this to Max just before rushing off to the comfortable and humane slaughterhouse. Having heard her story, Max thought it would be disrespectful not to eat her. The chicken had come from a genetically modified bird, which had been decerebrated. In other words, it had lived the life of a vegetable, with no awareness of self, environment, pain or pleasure. Killing it was therefore no more barbarous than uprooting a carrot. Yet, as the plate was placed before him, Max felt a twinge of nausea. Was this just a reflex reaction caused by a lifetime of vegetarianism? Or was it the physical sign of a justifiable psychic distress? Collecting himself, he picked up his knife and fork. That comes from The Restaurant at the End of the Universe by Douglas Adams, who I think is quite an impressive philosopher for our age. It's quoted in a book called The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten, which is by Julian Baggini, and he's brought together quite a lot of thought experiments, in fact 100 thought experiments, many from Enlightenment thinkers. Think, challenge, don't just take things as handed down. In fact, the main idea of the Enlightenment was challenge everything. This showed itself in scepticism towards doctrines of the Church, a rejection of emotion in favour of reason, a valuing of the individual, the belief in science and the experimental method, and the belief that education could be a catalyst for change. It also led to a demand for political representation. Thinkers associated with the Enlightenment include de Holbach and the Encyclopedists in France, David Hume in Scotland, and Immanuel Kant in Germany. And that picture of the statue of David Hume on the Royal Mile in Scotland is, to my mind, quite amusing. He championed reason, and yet people emotionally, sentimentally rub his toe. The battle of ideas that was to culminate in the Enlightenment began in the 17th century. That's the 1600s. And we get Francis Bacon, who advocated the use of the scientific method, and René Descartes, who proposed a critical rationalism. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." He's trying to find out what you could be really sure of. He decided that you could never be totally sure that your senses were telling the truth. But even when you were doubting, you were thinking. You could be certain of thought. So his followers were called the rationalists, trying to see out what you could work out using reason alone. But on the other side, we have Bacon and the experimentalists, the empiricists. They tested the world around them to see what was true. Now, like the rationalists, they didn't trust received wisdom, but unlike them, they didn't reject the senses. One of the key empiricists was John Locke. He thought the human mind at birth was a blank tablet on which experience writes the general principles and details of all knowledge. Now that was completely opposed to rationalists. Rationalists wanted knowledge by thought alone. The empiricists used experimental sciences. De Holbach published his Système de la Nature in 1770, in which he asserted that explanations of nature should not be sought in traditional beliefs or revelations of the Church, but through the applications of the scientific method. In the middle of this, we had Kant trying to reconcile the empiricists and the rationalists, hence his critique of pure reason. Now, medieval philosophers had combined Christian belief with the ideas of Plato or Aristotle. So we have Thomas Aquinas trying to explain what happens in communion through Aristotle's ideas. In the medieval world, philosophers respected their predecessors and accepted their methods. So, if a new discovery about nature contradicted one of Aristotle's principles, for example, they would have actually assumed it was the discovery that was in error rather than Aristotle. We, on this side of the Enlightenment, are bemused by that. But they took Plato and Aristotle as true. And so everything else had to be based on what they said. But Enlightenment thinkers weren't content to accept appeals to Aristotle's authority. You see, using experimental methods, science was progressing and increasing our understanding of nature. And it could only happen by rejecting some of Aristotle's assumptions. You could argue the Reformation was the father of the Enlightenment, because at the Reformation people started to question the authority of the Church and its received teachings, which had by this stage included all that Greek philosophy in a medieval format. Once the Church and Aristotle could be questioned, so could the rule of monarchs. So the French thinkers were directly responsible for the French Revolution. Some of the key thinkers in France were the encyclopédists. The Encyclopédie ou Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers was published in 17 volumes between 1751 and 1765. It aimed to provide information on every sphere of knowledge, and particularly to promote the application of science in industry, trade and the arts, epitomising the spirit of the Enlightenment. Denis Diderot was the main editor. Voltaire, the pen name of François-Marie Huret, also edited and contributed to the Encyclopédie. Now, Voltaire was anti-Christian, critical of the clergy, the king and the privileges of nobility. He was highly influential in the rise of liberal thought in continental Europe. One spin-out from this was the idea of deism. Now, the first thinkers who could be called deists were trying to come up with a way of showing the rationality of belief in God without resorting to the special revelation of the Christian faith. So we get books such as John Tollan's Christianity Not Mysterious. Matthew Tyndall in 1730 produced Christianity as Old as the Creation. They argued that Christianity is the religion of nature. And where Christianity had beliefs in supernatural events, such as the incarnation of God in Jesus, they rejected those as superstitious. Deists were resisted by writers such as Bishop Joseph Butler, whose Analogy of Religion, 1736, argued for a supernatural religion. In France, deists such as Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau laid the ground for different ways of thinking. Rousseau had a complex life. He started as Protestant, became a Catholic, became a deist, became a Protestant. He argued for human dignity, and yet he left his 5 illegitimate children in orphanages. He blamed his shortcomings on civilizations. He argued that people left themselves were noble and good, but society corrupts them. He argued a child will naturally teach himself. He also famously argued for the social contract between people and their rulers. If rulers broke the law, they could be deposed. This was a challenge to the view held in France on the divine right of kings. His was the thinking behind the American Declaration of Independence and then the French Revolution in 1789. In religion, he rejected the church dogma in favour of reason and conscience. For him, God was a being beyond all beings who could be felt but was beyond rational thought. Voltaire shared this view and attacked the church, who seemed to want to control God, as deceitful and corrupt. A German deist called G.E. Lessing was a dramatist and amateur theologian who argued that the resurrection was a fraud perpetrated by the disciples who wanted to carry on their easy way of life. He believed all religions are relative and will be superseded one day by a universal religion. Meanwhile, the enlightened person realises this and lives according to good sense, tolerance and harmony. Those who saw themselves as enlightened were very smug and patronising, in my opinion, and tolerance only went so far. So, for example, in France, liberty, equality and fraternity did not include those who had supported the old regime. You were tolerated as long as you agreed with the new thinking. In America, all men are equal, except for the ones who aren't. For example, African slaves or women.